to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, where we have a different perspective this week. Normally we have people who are historians or trained in history. Today we don't have that. We are very excited to have somebody trained in geography to talk about a new book from the University of Regina Press entitled The Magnificent Nahanni, The Struggle to Protect a Wild Place. And he is nearly live from Waterloo, Ontario. Happy to be joined on the phone by Gordon Nelson. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much. Good to be here.
So
Good
this,
to talk about the book.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this book too, because I have no familiarity with the high north, the territories. I've never been up there at all, but you look at some of the images of the Nahanni National Park and the reserve, and they're breathtaking images. And so for you to be able to write this book about this place is really kind of cool, and I'm excited to delve into it. But before we do that, where did this idea come from? You know, you mentioned you're a geographer, so where does the idea particularly of the Nahanni as a subject of a book come from?
Say there's probably several steps on it, but the most immediate one was I have done a lot of work in the north over the years. I was president of the National and Provincial Parks Association, which subsequently became the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. I was doing that work in the early 70s, and that was a time when the oil development was really getting underway. There was a lot of expansive ideas about what to do in the north, and I got involved from the perspective of a proposal that the federal government made to establish three parks up north, three major parks. Uatuq on South Baffin Island, Nahanni, which we're going to talk about, and Kluane in the southwestern Yukon, all of which are remarkable places. And they're interesting physically, they're interesting historically. And I went on and I was fortunate enough to be a resources advisor to the Inuit Tapirasat in their first land claim proposal, which didn't work out as well as it might have, mainly I think because of the need for more attention to local village concerns and local group concerns, but which was part of the process that eventually led to Nunavut. And I did some other things in the NWT on land use regulations and so on, and I was involved in the Yukon pipeline assessment proposal. So I was fortunate in going to many places in the north, and I heard quite frequently about the Nahanni, but I never got a chance to go there. It's a little bit difficult to get to, not so much now as it was then. So anyway, when the park proposals came up, and it took them a long time, the park was first proposed in 1976, and it was an imperfect proposal in that it ran into a number of difficulties, one with mining groups and another, which continue, and another one with the Indigenous people themselves, who didn't like some of the proposals that were put forward for surrendering their land and making it all publicly owned, and also for giving up all their traditional activities in a pure wilderness model, no human beings involved. So when I followed this struggle from 76 until it was finally expanded to watershed scale with the cooperation of the natives in 2009, and I remained active with the conservation community. And when it was done, and there was a big celebration about it, it was a remarkable achievement, I began to think, well, you know, this is another story that's remarkable and has a lot of lessons in it, a lot of things people could learn about, and if somebody doesn't write something about it, it's just going to recede into the background and be forgotten like so many others are. I mean, Cochin established 10 parks or 11 parks between the late 60s and the mid-70s or late 70s. And there, to my knowledge, there's virtually no story about how those things were established and how things were worked out with local people and so on. And some of them were rather difficult to do. There was a lot of opposition and concern from locals. So I thought, well, I'll see how it goes. I'll write an article, and of course.
That's how it goes. That's how it always starts. That's how they get you.
The article, of course, expanded into what I've now produced, and I went into the Nahanni for the first time. I did a raft trip for about 7 days, and met a guy, Neil Hartling, who's quite a remarkable guy. He runs the Nahanni River Adventures trips, and he has been active up there since the 80s, very knowledgeable. And so I learned a lot from him and others on the trip, and I did the usual trips to archives, and I drew my own experience, and so that's how the book came about.
And what's interesting about it to me is that the book is listed on the University of Regina's site not as a history book. If you look at it, it's under Environmental Conservation and Protection, Territories in Nunavut and Wilderness. It's not under history, and I would assume that's in part because you're not a historian by training, and when you worked at the various schools, the universities that you worked at, you were never in a history department. But from listening to you talk, it seems like you adopted a very historical methodology on this.
It's historical ecology. That's the traditional word for it now. And you raise a very important point. One of the things that I wasn't, it didn't warm me to history in my younger days, was a lack of awareness and interest in environment. Environment was seen as an easy way out. You could find an explanation for something by just opting to some kind of physical change, environmental change, and a lot of historians thought that was too easy. And there was also the interest in historians in the cultural side of things and the human side of things and leaders and individual leaders and their role. But environmental history or historical ecology began to come to the fore, I think, just about the time a lot of this park stuff was unraveling. I think Justice Berger, who conducted a remarkable public consultation program around the first proposal for the Mackenzie Valley pipeline, was in many ways a person who motivated this change, because he, as a lawyer, I guess, with some historic background, just drew on all the elements in the history of the Mackenzie Valley and the people in it to create a picture that is interactive and does involve people interacting with the environment. So I began to pursue that in my own work, but I called it Land Use History and Landscape Change, and it grew out of my interest in what happened in Banff National Park. And it's been intriguing to see environmental history and historical ecology become so important. There's some well-known books that bring it out. A guy called William Cronin, who is a Yale historian now, did a study. What was it called? Land use change in New England, something like that, in the early 80s, and it was a revolutionary book in the American historical sense, because it started people thinking about what he called in the book historical ecology. And then we got a guy called John Riley here in Ontario, who is actually a biologist, but who, in working with landowners and in looking at how changes came about in Ontario and in thinking about how to conserve the escarpment, got involved in the interaction between settlement and forest clearing and sorting out of species. And so he's written a remarkable book. It's called Once and Future Great Lakes Country, published by McGill Queens, I believe. So this is now a fairly established field, but it's a field that's essentially interdisciplinary. The historians, I think, are central to it, and I think they're beginning to realize that. But you get anthropologists involved, biologists involved, you get geographers involved. They're people who are fascinated by this interaction between economy and society, social things, and floods and earthquakes and forest succession and soil types and soil exhaustion and all those things. So it's a really exciting field, and it's still not widely known among many readers of history, but I hope it will be more widely known.
As you say, things are changing. I mean, our friends over at Niche and that organization with environmental history, and there are environmental history courses at schools across the country, and there are more and more environmental historians. So I think that is changing with historians, and at the same time, as you mentioned, it's very interdisciplinary. And the thing that's really, I think, essential about that is it's impossible for really any discipline to ignore the environment. I mean, we all live in the world, right? And the environment and the way the landscape and the physical world is changed and used is important to all disciplines. So it is a very interdisciplinary sector that is open to investigation.
Yeah, I think that it's something that I contemplate from time to time, and you must in the course of talking to people about the kind of work we're talking about now. There tends to be a sort of a paradigm, as we would call it, a fix on the way appropriate interpretations of knowledge and approaches to knowledge are made. I think for a long time it was a disciplinary fix or the silo fix. So people tended to define what was appropriate to each discipline and try and draw these boundaries. And when I was going through, that was when I was acquiring my various levels of education, that was very, very true until I got to Hopkins. When I got to Johns Hopkins, I found a different environment. It was a very freewheeling environment. The people were intermixing, and I think that sort of thing has spread. And I think the silos have begun to break down, and you see it in the physical sciences now in the universities, and you also see it in the economic programs, or in anthropology in particular, which has always had a bit of a bent that way anyway. And I think it's a good thing. Now, what it means in terms of organizing knowledge for learning by university students is another matter. I understand you're involved in Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies joint program. Well, that to me is a good example of crossing these boundaries, of crossing these silos, and the story becomes much more coherent, and I think much more interesting, much more realistic, much more attractive when told that way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the more perspectives you have, certainly the better the story is. So speaking of that story, let's delve into Nahanni and the specifics of it a little bit. So the park itself, if you look on the map, if you just Google it at home, the park and the reserve is on the border between Yukon and Northwest Territories, is how it's showing, with I think the entirety of it though in the Northwest Territories.
That's right. Yep.
So
the Flat River, the western section, actually just taps into the mountains along the border there.
Okay, and it's I have to say it looks huge too.
Yeah, it is 35,000 square kilometers. I think that's about it.
Yeah, so that's pretty huge.
Yeah, it is.
So when you sort of first dove into this, like, where did the initial push for a national park in this area come from?
Well, that was something I was quite interested in. One of the people who made the Nahanni famous was Raymond Patterson, who was a bit of an adventurer, and he wrote a book called The Dangerous River, which anybody who's interested in Nahanni should still read. It was published in 1954, 1955, but it's still on active sale now. It's been republished a number of times. But anyway, he got a lot of people interested in it, and then some other people came along, a guy called Finley Hunter. He did some writing on it, and another guy called Dick Turner wrote a book on the Nahanni back in the 70s, early 70s. And so, and it became a bit of a place to go among the more adventurous in our society, I would say. People would raft it, some fast rivers, some rapids. Other people would go to see it. The Virginia Falls, which was named after Finley Hunter's daughter, and which many people resent to this day because he's an outlander. That's a magnificent place. So that drew the attention of a lot of people, but none of these guys really said, let's protect it. It was interesting. Many of them were hunters and adventurers, and it just wasn't in the air at the time to protect it. But then the first notice I got of a potential park there was by a guy called Oldham, E.G. Oldham, and he was a superintendent of wildlife in the NWT in the early 40s. And he made a proposal, amazingly, very, very interesting proposal, that the Nahanni should be set up as a national park. And he made the proposal after he had visited it, because there were supposed to be a lot of wolves running around, and there was a suggestion that they might be called in. Some of the trappers who would benefit from such a call were supporting it, as well as others. But anyway, he went back and he wrote to Ottawa and to his superior, and he said, this place is remarkable. It's relatively very, very wild, has all kinds of different species in it, grizzly bears, caribou, elk. He thought there were 4 different kinds of mountain sheep. That was a proliferation of species that wasn't born later on. And so they set up a committee sometime later. I don't know, that somebody would really have to delve into the historic documents if they still exist. And it was a parliamentary committee, and they decided it was worthwhile to pursue it. But nothing very much happened until the 60s, and then in the 60s there was a lot of pressure for oil development. The Mackenzie proposals were coming forward, so people were concerned about some of these special places. So some guys in the national parks and some people in conservation organizations began to develop a proposal, and the proposal was put forward, as I said in my book, in 71, 72, and it was for 3 parks, Kluane, Nahanni, and the Ayuatuk, which is on the southeast corner of Baffin Island. And so the thing went from there. Once the parks guys are, in that era anyway, were announcing something, it really meant they were quite committed to trying to do it. And the public participation consisted of getting responses and trying to accommodate them as much as possible to the original proposal and then going ahead with it. And the federal government also had a very forceful, if I can put it that way, kind of approach to decision making. And so they proceeded to establish the park, but as a reserve, a national park reserve in 1976. And that was because of the objections of the First Nations people at Decho and the others to one, the wilderness concept. The idea at the time was that wilderness was devoid of human activity or very little sign of human activity, and that human activity was not appropriate to wilderness. It's an idea that's been modified considerably since. And so they didn't like that because they had been using this place and their ancestors had been using it for thousands of years. And second, they had to give up complete ownership and more or less control of policy. And that was a central issue in the whole thing for the next 20 years. And finally, through a lot of astute consultation and careful concern and input by outfits like the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, who began to work very close with the First Nations people, as well as Parks Canada, were kind of an intermediary and a spokesman for the public, and they informed the public. It finally was expanded to watershed scale, which was one of the original objectives. And in addition, a lot of compromises were made, agreements, perhaps to try and modulate the proposal to make it more acceptable to and inclusive of First Nations people. And so there's some hunting allowed in there, traditional activities, sacred sites, trapping, a little bit of trapping, things like that. But it's a huge place, as you said, and that sort of thing has been going on for a long time, and the First Nations people have not essentially impaired what's called the ecological integrity of the park. That is the fact that the ecosystems that have been there for a long time, the plants, animals, and processes have been there for a long time, are still there. And so that was a bit of a groundbreaker, along with some other stuff that happened in Nunavut with the Inuit when they were working out how to do parks after they got the Nunavut proposal through in, I think, 1995.
Yeah, because that's one of the really interesting parts of this is that, we live in a country that, frankly, is largely based on a colonial framework, and now here's a case where there's, I think, I think the desire to create a national park comes from a good place to preserve the land, but at the same time, there are constituent groups that are there that within the broader scope of the colonial history of this country, in my opinion, would be rightfully skeptical of a federal authority coming in and trying to establish some sort of management over that land that they have used for thousands and thousands of years. And it strikes me that the word struggle in the subtitle of this book, from what I can tell, that would be based on those discussions.
Yes, I think the struggle was, I kept wondering what the proper subtitle was for the book, and then I realized that it's a struggle all the way through. If we just take the concepts involved, you see, this becomes very fundamental because very words that are being used to evaluate the area are loaded. Wilderness, which was the fundamental aim and ideal of Parks Canada and many other conservationists, was a kind of mythical idea in the sense that, as archaeology has shown over the last 20 years or so, maybe longer, it turns out that Indigenous people have occupied some parts of our landscape for a very, very long time, and some of them were probably there up until they were hit by diseases or fur trade or other kinds of things that more or less remove them or reduce their impact on the landscape. But there's a long history of human use of these areas. So the picture as it's revealed as you look at the land use history in the area is a long continued use and occupants by Native people, and the attempt to reconcile that with some of these ideas like pristine wilderness, which were essentially really U.S. ideas. They were views of landscape that were diffused to Canada, beginning way back around 1900 with the first superintendent of Parks Canada, J.B. Harkin. And there's a struggle in other ways. The struggle for economic benefits, the struggle to reconcile this within the conservation community, many of which were in favor of a compromise, and others who wanted to be diehards and go for strict wilderness. Same thing with the Native people. The Native people and the Indigenous people tend to be looked at as a kind of blank slate. We haven't got to the point yet of really recognizing them in everyday terms as highly political people like the rest of us are. You know, some agree with some things, some with others. So the First Nations people have struggled with that, and they're still struggling with it. There's a proposal for a mine on Prairie Creek there, which is probably the main threat to the park right now. And there is, as I understand it, I haven't been up there for a couple of years, but there is, as I understand it, some difference of opinion in the Decho community over whether that mine should proceed or not.
Because that was something I was going to ask you, if, and getting back to something you said a bit earlier, is you mentioned that the indigenous groups that were there, they were not threatening the ecological state of this area, and yet the desire to have a national park is largely based on the idea of preserving the land. So so it seemed like a disconnect to me as to who is threatening the land if it's not the people who are living there and using it, and then why is there the need then to go in and in a way that I could see people thinking it in sort of this almost patriarchal or sort of this paternal idea of the government has to come in and protect this land when it's not really under threat from the people who are living there. So where was that threat coming from?
Well, there's a lot to what you say, but it's an exceedingly complex thing. What you're getting into is the history of ideas, which I think I did not anticipate that I would find myself struggling with that as I proceeded with the book. But that turned out to be the case, and there's still quite a bit of uncertainty about it. But there are a number of factors that contribute to the fact that the Nahanni is probably the closest to a what you might call a highly natural condition or a highly wild condition of any area in Canada. Now, one is its isolation. It's close, but for physical reasons, distant from settlement and ease of mining. There were attempts to explore for gold from the beginning of the Klondike rush, which is not very far away on the other side of the mountains. And there were a lot of the first people who went in there who were Caucasian anyway, or white, were veterans of the Klondike gold rush who swept over a lot of those streams under incredibly hard conditions to try and find gold. And that persisted and up until the time the park was established in 1976, the first small park. So the native people, in the midst of all that, have continued to hunt and trap the way they have. But there's some anthropologists who've been working in there and worked with them or with people around them who are of the generally same broad kin groups, who have found that they do traditionally practice conservation. A lot of indigenous leaders will tell you now that they're not. It's not reasonable to view them as massive killers of wildlife, because the wildlife in many ways are the basis of their economy and their well-being. So they always had ways of dispensing or handling these pressures, the balance between use and conservation. So they had, everything was infused with life, according to one of the anthropologists. So the rocks had a spirit, the genius loci, trees had a spirit, the wildlife had a spirit, and you had to propitiate those by appropriate ceremonies in advance. They did things in some of the native groups in Alaska, like having nets that had different perforation sizes so that they could select for the fish that they caught in the nets. They had beliefs about the inherent efficacy of of some animals to life, and if they were diminishing, they would reduce the pressure on them. So there were a lot of native mechanisms and attempts to try and preserve what was going on. I'm working now a similar book. I don't know whether it will come to fruition or not, but it's on the idea that cities should be wilder, and that we should be spending more time trying to build the wild back into the cities. In that sense, you run up against this same thing where indigenous people are seen, and it's not for a blank, sympathetic, simplistic sense, as all of one group, all doing the same thing. But inherent in all of these things were a lot of practices that they used to try and conserve environment. And so, as you say, they were there for thousands of years, and they didn't do that much harm to the environment, but at the same time, in fact, if anything, they may have sustained it. But at the same time, the area they were in was isolated. It was hard to get to. They probably didn't go into it as frequently as they could. There were also Native people, the Casca, who were on the Yukon side, who were competing with them to some degree for terrain. And so they had a kind of eco-zone between the two groups that you ventured into at your own risk, or one side to another. So that kind of mechanism, an inherent ecological mechanism, helped to protect the area as well. So it's a complex story, but the idea that the government had to remove the people to protect the environment, which is inherent in the wilderness idea, was central to the eventual solution to the watershed scale park in 2009, because a lot of the Parks Canada people and a lot of people in the public had to be made aware of the fact that conservation was not inherently a Caucasian or a white idea. It was something that had been long-lasting in the Indigenous people as well.
Well, in looking at the map here, in terms of the idea to protect this land, it doesn't seem, as I sort of zoom in on Google here and look at the borders of it, there doesn't seem to necessarily be a natural boundary on all the sides, and it's certainly not a square or just an easy shape. It's sort of jagged all around. So in that sense, you mentioned it's hard to get into, and maybe not that many people went into it, but how was the actual decision made on what constituted the actual park itself? And then in that, according to Google, at least, in looking at the map, sort of in the mid-eastern part of it, there's a gap, a small gap. I don't know if that's actually real and not part of the park, but that's there too. But just in terms of setting the borders, what was that process like?
Yeah, well, this is a really good question. It's referred to as a watershed park, with the implication that boundaries conform to the watershed of the Nahanni River and its tributaries. But in point of fact, it was modified. There was, in fact, a broad consultation process, and a group actually formed of DHO and Indigenous people and Parks Canada people, wilderness, Canadian Parks and Wilderness types, and local people to have a look at the boundaries and to try and reach a consensus. And I have not had access to a lot of the detailed documents on that. I doubt if they ever really still exist. But the back gap you talk about, for example, is probably around the mine, which pre-existed the establishment of the park. And when negotiations were made with the mining companies which had claims in the park, that one was retained because it had a fair amount of potential. It was supported, as I understand it, by the NW Territories government as a viable economic development prospect. So it's still there, and the boundaries around the mine enclose this gap in the park. And it's a part of the process that was needed to get the park, that they really, in many ways, almost had to compromise on that at the time.
Yeah, and actually, as you say that, I zoom in, and you're right. It's the Prairie Creek Mine.
Yeah,
that's
right.
there. It's not included. Yeah, so that's pretty interesting. But
so there, this is a zinc copper. It's a complex igneous rock formation, and it's at some depth. You have to go down, if I think I'm correct, a few hundred feet to get to it. And I may be off on that, but it's fairly deep. And the minerals you can get out of it are copper, zinc, lead, silver. And at the moment, the big interest is in zinc. And I know you're an avid follower of zinc prices on the stock exchange, aren't you, Sean?
Naturally, of course.
So you will realize that the zinc prices had gone to quite a low ebb, and there was some feeling on the part of some conservation groups that it might be bought out from the company. But now the zinc prices have gone way up. and the stock price has gone way up, and it's probably a bit too expensive to buy out now. So they're set up to mine, and they're on the floodplain, and they have actually done some mining and testing, although I don't think there's any commercial production yet because they can't get the stuff out. But the mercury and other chemicals are used in the treatment of the ore and in the production of the mineral, and so the potential for that to pollute Prairie Creek is fairly strong, or at least possible. And the other proposal that they're working on with now is they're building a mine. There's an environmental assessment going on, and they're going to build an access road, which will go from Nahanni Butte on the Liard River through the mountains and into the Prairie Creek Valley, so that the ore can be brought out. But where it will go from there is a bit of a mystery to me. Apparently, there's some proposal to truck it all the way down to the interior of BC or to the west coast.
Wow!
So it's a very curious kind of proposal, and it is something that apparently has got divided the First Nations people a little bit. The other boundary in that same area was extended beyond the Nahanni River watershed boundary because of the karst topography that is there. There's a guy called Derek Ford, who's a geomorphologist and geographer, physical geographer at McMaster. He's retired now, but he did an awful lot of work up there under the sponsorship of Parks Canada to explore the caves. Nahanni is very rich in caves, and in fact, some of these caves have been there for millions of years, and some actually contain remains of sheep skeletons and so on that have been dated back to, I think the one date was 2400 BC or something.
Wow.
These are animals that got caught in the caves and couldn't get out. And so he was, that's an interesting combination of a biological and a geological and a glaciological story. So he was taken in to do some research on that. And he's very concerned, and many other people are very concerned, that a lot of the drainage in that area is subterranean drainage, because the karst system, the water comes down, it hits the surface, and limestone, which is underneath karst, dissolves, and so the water percolates down into these underground streams, and it carves out channels beneath the surface. It also moves through the bedrock and into the river. So you could get quite an impact if you began to pollute the water in that area. A lot of the water in the river probably comes from the karst in the first place.
Right.
So they decided, when they set the park up, to extend the boundary beyond the watershed to encapsulate as much of this karst terrain as they could. Another guy called John Weaver, who did a lot of research towards the end of the park establishment on the boundaries, also found some limestone beyond the northeastern corner of the park. And so in the end, they established it beyond there to try and incorporate this park on an area that's called the Ram Plateau, which is, there's some pictures of it in my book, which are air photographs or photographs taken from a high vantage point. So you can see these remarkable valleys and rivers that have been carved out of this karst. So that in itself became a kind of unexpected feature of the park proposal at the end, and it was incorporated into the 209 expansion. On the other side, on the Yukon side, part of the Flat Creek proposal is, if I remember correctly, inside, the boundary is inside the watershed, and that's because there was a big tungsten mine there for a while and it operated off and on for years. When prices were good, it operated. When prices were not so good, it tended to slow down. But apparently, I'm told from good sources that there's a lot of debris around there, and there is some pollution, and the pollution is in the Flat Creek, and there's some big concerns about that. But the mining people were, and their supporters, there's many in government and business, were able to get that section left out at a time when it looked viable still from an economic point of view. So the boundary there was adjusted for that reason. And then there's a park, Natchitoches Park, which is a Satu Park, Satu First Nations Park on the North Park. And that was to be a separate park, Natchitoches National Park. And in the work up to that, some decisions were made that are pretty questionable, because there's sections in there that were left out. Within the upper watershed, there are prime grizzly bear habitat, prime areas for caribou, and so the conservation groups are still working to try and get that one fixed. The story here is one of eternal civic vigilance.
Yeah.
The citizens have to be constantly aware of what's going on, and they have to be interested enough to influence political opinion on it, because the forces that have a vested interest in these areas are always interested, and they're always watching. And so when you think you never really win, well, that's a bit extreme, but most conservation stories are ongoing. They're and that's again the struggle idea. You have to watch, you have to be interested, you have to have groups to make representation, you have to make sure you're looking after the larger civic or national interest. And the Nahanni is a prime example of that. We started with 1945 or 1946, and it's taken from 1945-46 through the first park establishment in 76, through the expansion in 2009, and we've still got these places that are still contentious, and you have to stay interested in them if you want to make sure that the interests you value are represented well and adhered to.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, what do you think the legacy of this project is? But I would venture a guess that that's what you would say, that it's the idea of vigilance.
Be probably the first thing I would say, that it's not finished yet. You got to keep at it. It's a remarkable achievement. It's a testament to everybody involved that they were able to come to an agreement on it. Lots of people are both happy and unhappy about it. What is it that the politicians say, that if everybody's unhappy, they've probably done a good job. So I wouldn't be a strong proposal of that point of view, but there was a lot of compromise, and the compromises are often momentary. They're often done for political reasons, and they're understandable human reactions. And the idea is wait another day, and you might be able to make more progress on what you were trying to do in the first place. So conservation is a dynamic, ongoing process, and that's something that I didn't forcefully make well enough in the book. I did try to make it at the end in looking at other examples of things like this that have been done in other parts of the world. But it's something that's still not really salient in the Canadian mentality or in many other mentalities than it should be.
And I think that's a great way to frame it and have it as a lesson, right? I think there was an article today or yesterday, I can't remember what outlet it was, but saying that the Canadians are sort of per capita the worst in terms of environmental conservation in the world. As Canadians, we have all this land, but perhaps we take it for granted and aren't as serious about conservation as maybe some other countries who aren't as fortunate in the natural landscapes and the things that are available to them, and therefore we don't take it as seriously as perhaps we should, and maybe that's one of the things that we need to take away from this book, that, as you say, it's always being vigilant and always paying attention to how land is used and how, as humans, we can not disrupt the natural order of things as much as humanly possible.
Yeah, I think that that probably comes back to my prime motivation for writing the book, which was this is a story like other stories. It's a struggle between development and conservation. Those are ideologically pure concepts that in practice don't really hold, because there's always an interaction between what people are trying to do economically and what is going on environmentally and socially. But and that's the human physical interaction that we were talking about earlier. The other thing that it brings out, I think, when you start contemplating it, and I wish I'd had a little more time to work with this, but it's a big topic. But we tend to have, as Canadians, we tend to have quite a big view of our virtues. We tend to see ourselves as perhaps a little better at most things than we really are. And again, it needs a little thought to sort out. But I don't think we tend to see the impacts we have on the environment in as realistic terms as we should. We do really. Well, take water, for example. We are prolific in our use of water, and we have all kinds of it, but we forget that we're contaminating it all the time.
Right.
And water may still be there in the voluminous sense, but in the quality sense, it's probably quite a different matter. We have made good progress in environmental and conservation concerns. Air quality is a good example, but I think our forest policy, our tree policy, and our parks policy still remain to be strengthened. They're not ideal, and so that gets back again to the idea of constantly trying to watch them and improve them.
Yeah, and another reason why people should pick up this book and see what the struggle is all about in this case. So again, the book is The Magnificent Nahanni, The Struggle to Protect a Wild Place, from the University of Regina Press. We encourage you to go pick it up. It's available in paperback now, so that's terrific. And the author, of course, Gordon Nelson, who we are thrilled to have had joined us from Waterloo. So Gordon, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I've enjoyed it. You're a challenging interviewer. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I try my best. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.